Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a story of absolutely staggering global ambition, relentless travel, and, ultimately, profound sacrifice. We're looking at a man who basically looked at a map of the entire world and just saw endless possibilities. We're talking about the father of Methodist missions. Now, I want you to really picture this with me. It's the dead of night, May 2nd, 1814. We are aboard a missionary ship called the Lady Melville. This ship is literally cutting through the Blackwater on a massively long and incredibly dangerous journey, miles and miles away from the safe, comfortable English society it left behind. We're somewhere out in the vast, almost suffocating darkness of the Indian Ocean. The ship is pushing towards Ceylon, what we know today as Sri Lanka. You've got this oppressive tropical heat, an utterly unforgiving sea, and the isolation out here on the open water, it's absolute. You are truly cut off from the rest of the world. And it's right here, on this stormy, pitch-black night, the tragedy strikes the expedition. An elderly English preacher, a guy who had literally just been working and writing with this incredible enthusiasm during the voyage, suddenly falls ill and dies. With zero chance of bringing his body to land, his remains are committed to the deep. He leaves behind a grave with no tombstone, no church surrounding it, just the vast, endless ocean. Okay, let's dive right into this. Who exactly was this man? Well, his name was Thomas Coke. And you really have to wonder, how did this 66-year-old preacher, someone who had already spent decades organizing churches, training ministers, and basically building the architecture of one of the world's great missionary movements, how did he end up here? I mean, how does the guy who spent his entire life sending other people across oceans become one of the very first great Methodist missionaries to actually die while crossing one himself? Which brings us to Section 1, the Wesleyan Awakening, from Oxford to the fields. Because to truly grasp the sheer magnitude of this story, we've got to flash all the way back to 1747. We're in Brecon, Wales, where a very comfortable, predictable status quo was about to be completely disrupted.
See, the path Coke was born into stands in stark contrast to the path he actually chose. On the one hand, you have the Anglican clergyman. Born to a wealthy apothecary, which is essentially like an early, very well-off pharmacist, Coke had the whole package: the elite Oxford education, the high society connections, and the prospect of a highly respectable, stable career. But on the other hand, you have the Methodist missionary, because after colliding with John Wesley's movement, Coke chose a totally radical, itinerant life. He abandoned that cushy parish life to travel constantly, preaching to everyday, ordinary folks in fields, in their homes, in town marketplaces. That major shift in focus basically turned him into the preacher who lost his pulpit. Coke started going all in on personal conversion, salvation through faith, and this intense call to holiness. And, well, his Anglican superiors were not having it. They were highly uncomfortable with all this outdoor preaching and his total departure from the traditional orderly parish system. And eventually, it cost him his official church position. But, and here's the crazy part, losing that pulpit is exactly what pushed him into a history-altering partnership. He linked up closely with the Methodists and came under the direct, powerful influence of John Wesley himself.
Moving into Section 2, Architect of a Global Movement, Scaling the Vision. Now, Wesley was smart. He immediately recognized Coke's unique cosmopolitan energy, so he tasked him with something massive, taking this highly localized British revival and scaling it up into a full-blown worldwide phenomenon.
And this brilliantly illustrates how they navigated one of their very first major roadblocks, which was America. You see, after the American Revolution, Methodist societies over in the colonies were completely cut off from British preachers. So Wesley makes this incredibly bold move to ordain ministers for America, and he sends Coke across the Atlantic in 1784. At the famous Christmas conference in Baltimore, the Methodist Episcopal Church is officially organized. Coke, bringing this high-level international vision and his knack for constant border crossing, partnered perfectly with Francis Asbury, who was the ultimate boots-on-the-ground itinerant organizer. Together, they built this independent structure that turned Methodism into one of the absolute fastest-growing movements in the young United States. But Coke's vision? It was just staggering. His ambition sprawled across an unbelievable global map. We're talking North America, the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, Ireland. The guy even dreamed of reaching China and the Pacific. He personally crossed the Atlantic over and over again, totally defying the agonizingly slow and dangerous transportation of his era. He was constantly hustling, raising money, writing these fiery missionary appeals, corresponding with leaders and recruiting. For Thomas Coke, doing missionary work literally meant relentless, unstoppable movement.
Now, we have to recognize that operating globally in the 18th century meant colliding head-on with the Atlantic slave system. And this was especially true during his missions down to Caribbean islands like Antigua, Jamaica, and Barbados. This created enormous, inescapable moral and practical tensions. You see, Methodism strictly emphasized the absolute spiritual equality of all human beings before God. And obviously, that is in direct conflict with deeply unequal, brutal plantation societies. Facing highly suspicious colonial governments, Coke actually spoke out against slavery and supported abolitionist causes. He firmly believed that Christianity was fundamentally incompatible with the dehumanization of enslaved people.
So, to actually sustain this incredible global expansion against massive, crushing challenges, we're talking poverty, disease, intense political opposition, Coke couldn't just rely on sheer passion. He needed a hardcore strategy. Which brings us to Section 3, the blueprint for missions, building to last. Let's move to this and see how this all builds, because Coke basically operated like the brilliant architect of a modern global franchise. He relied on this really systematic 4-pillar blueprint to scale the whole operation. Step 1, preachers, to get out there and proclaim the message. Step 2, teachers and schools to establish baseline literacy. Step 3, Christian literature to actually translate the core texts. And absolutely crucially, Step 4, local leadership. This ensured that indigenous Christians would eventually be the ones leading their own churches. His underlying philosophy here was simple but honestly profound. He believed Christianity needed institutions that could actually survive way beyond the missionary's own lifetime. He knew that for churches to last, they needed educated ministers and highly organized communities. Because of this exact blueprint, the whole movement became an educational engine just as much as an evangelical one. He was setting up serious, long-term infrastructure.
And that brings us to Section 4, the final voyage, the Indian Ocean calls. Fast forward to 1813. Big changes in the British East India Company's charter finally cracked open the door to Coke's absolute ultimate dream, reaching South Asia.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the sheer audacity of this number. 66. Thomas Cook was 66 years old when he organized this massive expedition. Think about it. Most guys his age, especially after building a huge global organization from scratch, would just comfortably retire back in Britain, maybe direct the mission safely from a desk somewhere. But nope, not Cook. Instead, he recruits a brand new team and embarks on yet another grueling, insanely dangerous ocean voyage. Why? Because he absolutely refused to let his team share risks that he wouldn't take himself. Which leads us right to this timeline, and it is just filled with this profound, almost poetic irony. In late December 1813, an incredibly enthusiastic Thomas Coke sets sail from England, totally convinced they're a part of this huge historic moment. But man, the voyage is rough. Vicious storms batter the ship, the tropical climate is just brutal, and Coke's health is already fragile. In early May 1814, he falls suddenly ill, and on May 2nd, he is buried at sea in the Indian Ocean. The very man who spent his entire life telling everyone else to cross oceans to spread the gospel literally died while crossing one himself.
You know, his devastated companions could have easily just thrown in the towel and abandoned the whole expedition right then and there. But this is where we see the true, undeniable power of his architectural blueprint. The mission survived the man. Because of the rigid, systematic structure he had instilled in them, those missionaries pushed forward. They eventually made it to Ceylon, they established the mission, they translated the literature, they trained local teachers, and they built the bedrock of what would become the Methodist Church in Sri Lanka. Coke never physically walked onto that shore, but his vision absolutely did.
At the end of the day, Thomas Coke left behind no grand empire. He didn't become fabulously wealthy, and he certainly established no political dynasty. Instead, his was a legacy measured entirely in miles and churches. I mean, his life can literally be traced right across a map. Born in Wales, educated at Oxford, preaching across the fields of Britain, crossing the wild Atlantic to organize American Methodism, dreaming of Africa, and finally resting in the deep waters of the Indian Ocean. He belonged to a rare generation that took a local, grassroots revival and transformed it into a worldwide movement through global communities, local schools, and homegrown leaders. Ultimately, his greatest contribution was his totally unyielding conviction that if Christianity was truly meant for all people, it simply could not be boxed in by geography. His life, his relentless drive, and his ultimate sacrifice leave behind a really powerful challenge that honestly still echoes today. It's a provocative thought I want to leave you with as we wrap up this explainer. If the gospel is for every nation, who will cross the ocean to take it there?